So how many of you have been to Pittsburgh? How many of you are Steeler fans? We got a couple back here. Maybe you don't want to admit it, right? I'm delighted to be here, but what does the former mayor of Pittsburgh have to say to a crowd from Ocala? A lot? No, I don't. You have a great place. I've had a chance to look around a little bit, but what Pittsburgh went through as the center of industrial manufacturing of America, I grew up with it, to a city once known as hell with the lid off. Pittsburgh was, to what it is today, ranked by The Economist and Forbes magazine as the most livable city in America. How did that happen? And in fact, what I've learned is that every city in America now is facing the same kinds of challenges that Pittsburgh was facing in the 70s and the 80s and 90s and in the 2000s. And we were just a little ahead of the curve in terms of the remarkable collapse of our steel industry and then the opportunity to rebuild a different kind of city. Every city's facing that kind of transformation. And there's a story that typifies that for me. How many of you have ever heard of Horatio Nelson Jackson? We have a guy back there. Changed your lives, and none of you even know about him. And let me tell you the story about Horatio Nelson Jackson. Horatio Nelson Jackson was a doctor from Vermont, and he was in California at a medical convention at the dinner with a group of other doctors, and they were debating the impact of the automobile on American society. And all the other doctors at dinner that night thought it was really a toy for the rich. There was no infrastructure, no support for it. And Horatio believed it was going to be a game changer, and he bet them all $50 that he could drive across the United States in 90 days. And they all laughed and took the bet. And the very next day, Horatio went out and bought his first car, a Winton. He convinced the young mechanic, Sewall, Crocker, to go with him. And for whatever reasons that day, they bought a dog named Bud. And the very next day, with no support and nobody writing about him, Horatio, Sewall, and Bud were on their way driving across the United States. It was 1903. And in 1903, there were 8,000 cars in America, 150 miles of paved road, and no highway department in any state. 63 and a half days later, Horatio, Sewall, and Bud drove down Fifth Avenue in New York City. They were the first people to drive across the United States. That was in 1903. By 1923, there were 10 million cars, hundreds of thousands of miles of paved road, and and a highway department in every state. Society as we knew it in 20 years changed completely. We're there now. We're sitting where Horatio Nelson Jackson was in 1903, looking at a world that is going to be fundamentally transformed in the next 20 years. You get a glimpse of it right now every day, don't you? And that transformation is happening because of globalization, because of technology, the advances of technology, and by the very demographics of what we're becoming as a society. And you can like it or not, but this is an inevitable force. You can see the Florida and Miami and in Jacksonville and all the way up the East Coast and all the way across the Gulf, trying to build bigger ports to take advantage of the expanded Panama Canal in the next couple years are going to bring. That's all about globalization. And what do all we carry all around in our pockets? I have an antique. How many of you are walking around with those iPhones and that technology that fundamentally changed it? And then the demographics. We're going to add in the United States another 100 and some million people over the next 20 or 30 years of the United States. And you're going to add a continued growth in the whole region here of increasing population and the question of how you accommodate that population, how you educate them, the infrastructure you build for them, the choices you make about your developments all will impact the quality of life of Central Florida and the kind of community that you will have. And these are the trendsetters. There's people that look like me who are getting older, and our choices look very different than what they were. You know, I was speaking at a college class a couple weeks ago, and I said, you know, for the last 50 years, we've sort of pursued an Ozzie and Harriet development pattern. And nobody in the room knew who Ozzie and Harriet was. Talk about feeling old, right? Well, you all know what I mean, or at least some of you do, and know what I mean by Ozzie and Harriet. Ozzie and Harriet sort of defined the American dream, the mom and dad and the white picket fence and 2 kids and a car in the driveway. And back when Ozzie and Harriet were TV stars, 75% of the households in America were couples. You know what it is today? It's below 40%. We look very different, not only who we are, and those of us with gray hair increasingly don't want to drive as much. You know, we would rather live in a community where we could walk to a restaurant and maybe to buy that quart of milk and not have to get in a car and go everywhere. And that is a trend. If you read AARP or one of the senior magazines, you know that's a trend. Even a bigger generation now are the Gen Yers, the people between 18 and 32. I have some kids about that age, and you know they are the largest generation in the history of America. There are 83 million of them. Think about where they're coming into the market. On average, if they've gone to college, they have a $23,000 college debt. They're coming into a housing market for the first time in our history where we've lost value. So there's a real question about the choices they're going to make about where they want to live. And in surveys of the Gen Yers, 75% of them want to live in urban areas, in walkable communities, in either big cities or smaller cities, but places that they can walk. They don't have to worry about driving. So think about the impact that begins to have on real estate. The third big cohort in our population are immigrants, people that have come to the United States, and they're going to be huge drivers of population growth in communities all across America. This is a 100-year history of home ownership in America. And you can see between 60 and 90, we sort of plateaued at about 62% of the households in America own their houses. And that jumped because of federal policies from the 1990s. You can see almost up to 70%. It has now dropped. Each percentage there is worth 1.5 million households. So that has huge implications on, think about the Gen Yers coming into the marketplace, first-time home buyers, the choices they're going to make. And so the belief is that we're going to be looking at 10 or 15 million people who might in another time bought a house now be thinking about renting a house. And so that, as you think about you building your community, think about what that means. And these are trends that it's true all across America. In the 1990s, in Metropolitan Chicago, for example, of all the new houses built in Metropolitan Chicago in the early 90s, only 7% were built in downtown Chicago or the surrounding neighborhoods of downtown Chicago. By 2008, 45% of the houses built in Metropolitan Chicago, this is a 10-county region, 45% were in downtown Chicago. So you begin to see this trend all across America. In Tampa, in Sacramento, in Portland, in Denver, in Chicago, in New York, a trend where people are moving to urban, walkable places. This is not people being forced to move there. This is the market beginning to make choices about where they want to live. And part of this is impacted by the employment. Now, some of you might not be able to look at it. I want you to look at these two numbers right there. That's Tampa and Orlando. So, you know, if I would go and say, Orlando, Disney World, right? Everybody works in tourism. In fact, in Orlando, the education and healthcare services have jumped from 60% of the workforce in Tampa or in Orlando in 1990 was in education and health services. It's now a 152% increase. Almost 200,000 people in the Orlando metropolitan area work in education and health services. You can see the same kind of big jump in the Tampa market also, and in professional services. So we are watching where people have worked significantly shift to technology-related jobs. And that shift has an impact on where people live. It also has, it begins to speak about the kind of investments a community needs to make to be competitive in this world economy. You can see the jumps in other areas also. And so I want to suggest to you that what made a city successful in the 20th century, maybe because of their location, and they were, as Pittsburgh was, near a river or near a crossroads, as Atlanta was, good railroads, that there is a different set of parameters that will make us a city successful in the 21st century. I think the one common one is it needs to be well managed. It needs to be a place where people want to live. It needs to have an educated population and a commitment to education. It needs to have raw materials, which I'll talk about. It needs to be entrepreneurial, understand how the city partners with the private sector in a whole variety of ways to make developments happen, as Mayor Gwynn tells me might be happening here soon in Ocala. And it needs to understand how to finance those that are going to look very different than what we did. And part of the well-managed is that cities aren't islands. They're part of a region. Ocala, your downtown defines the quality of your region. It's what people see. If they see a downtown that's blighted and with vacant buildings, as this might have been a few years ago, then people have less of a reason to want to invest there. And part of the challenge we have in America today is we have lots of governments. There are 74,000 local governments in America, and there's 13,500 school districts. Now, what does that mean? It means that in a global economy, when we're competing with England and Germany and China that have centralized education systems and make huge investments in education, our ability to compete in a global economy depends on volunteers at 13,500 school districts and local council people and mayors who are going to make the right decisions to position their communities. And so you understand how, in the context of how we are competing now, these people become very, very important in making the right choices for your community. The second is that cities need to be safe. This is the homicide rate in New York City. I use this because it's so dramatic. In 1990, the homicides in New York City hit almost 2,300 people in a year were murdered. Can you imagine? And it was a time when there were articles in the paper and national news that basically said, you know, companies don't want to locate in New York, and people didn't want to be tourists there because they were concerned about the crime. They elected a new mayor, Rudy Giuliani, and he hired a police commissioner, Bill Bratton, and literally in 2 years, they cut the homicide rate almost by 3 or 4 times. Now, they didn't move all the bad guys to New Jersey. Maybe moved some of them, but they understood that they needed to manage in a different kind of way. They needed to use technology. It changed how policing is done all over America. And it had a huge impact. Cities need to get it right. They need to understand that they need to be well managed, and they need to be efficiently managed to be able to be successful. Let me give you an example. This is from Tallahassee, and their planning department, that Tallahassee expects to add 45,000, 46,000 new households over the next 20 years people are going to move to Tallahassee. About 50,000 new households. And so they figured out if everybody bought a house, one house per acre. That's some people's idea of heaven. One house per acre. It's going to cost them almost $9.5 billion to invest in the infrastructure to accommodate that one house per acre. So all those red dots. If they were going to, the same 45,000 households, if they build 8 units per acre, it would only cost them $1 billion to put in the infrastructure, the roads, sewer, and water. If they built 20 units per acre, which is sort of a townhouse and single-family detached and some apartments, sort of a mixed development you'd see in sort of downtown Ocala here, it's only going to cost them $500 million to put in the infrastructure. So whether you're a liberal or a conservative, the conversation about how you develop as a community has a lot to do with the amount of taxes your kids are going to pay and about the quality of the place that you live. It is worth having that conversation, not only with Mayor Gwynn here, but to Mayor Gwynn and the surrounding communities about how do we do this in a smart kind of way that minimizes the kind of investments we're going to make that's going to saddle our kids with payments that they have to make to put in that infrastructure. The other piece I mentioned is vibrant. How many have been to Chicago and seen Millennium Park? So some of you, the mayor Daley makes a decision on an old railroad yard right in the middle of downtown Chicago. Instead of developing the property, the city buys it. They partner with civic leaders and they make a decision to build a park. And it is a world-class park. It is a world-class park. And if you've been there, you know that thousands of people on a nice summer day go there to get spit on. It is a remarkable decision about leadership. And this is a decision that every community faces every day. It's a decision about whether you want to be an it'll-do community or whether you want to be a world-class community. Chicago made a decision they were going to build a world-class park, one that is now the most visited place in Chicago. That was a choice they made. They could have made a choice to simply put a grass field there or a parking lot, a surface parking lot. They made a choice to do something very spectacular. You need to make the same kind of choice, Mayor. You need to say, we're not going to just reach to the lowest common denominator. We want to reach up. We want to be a community when people drive into Ocala, they'll say, this is a world-class community. You don't want to have that sign, welcome to Ocala, we're an it'll-do community. So you never want to build anything that's not reaching, that's not challenging. I mentioned education. You're doing okay, but I want you to look for a moment at the research triangle or Pittsburgh in terms of the increases over the last 20 years on your graduation rates in high school and in your bachelor's degrees and your graduate degrees. This is your competitive advantage. Your ability to educate your community from K all the way through and to keep those young people will a large part be your ability to compete in a global economy. Education is one of the really important pieces. And I mentioned raw materials, and we're sitting in a building that's an example of the opportunity you have in Ocala. There's almost $400 billion a year spent on research in America. Our biggest competitive advantage is innovation. How many of you are walking around with an iPhone in your pocket? So what do you think it costs to manufacture that and ship it to you here in Ocala from China? $3. Huh? $3. I have $3. Do I have a higher bid? Do I have $5? It costs $7.53. Now, you paid about $200 for it, right? So if I'm a manufacturer or the shipper, I get $7.53. If I'm the innovator, I get $192. What do you want to be both, really? But if you had your choice, what do you want to be? You want to be the innovator. That's America's competitive advantage right now. And it's driven in large part by our willingness at the federal level. Almost 30% of the money we're investing in research is coming from the federal government, of our willingness as a country to invest in research. And this is us compared to the rest of the world. And you can see the big blue blob there is the United States, and China and Japan are the next closest. But we have historically kept our technological competitive advantage because of that level of innovation. And you might not realize this, but you're the research triangle right here in Ocala, because around you in Tampa, at Gainesville, and in Orlando, there's almost $1 billion annually being spent on research right now in those three schools. So you are really at the center of major research taking place. And your ability to think about how you take advantage of your location, sort of central between the three of them, is, I think, a competitive advantage that you probably have not fully taken advantage of. And you might want to think about that and what your connections might be. And let me give you an example. Do you all know about the Research Triangle? Have you been up there? So let me just tell you a quick story. In the late 1950s, 6 guys were at a golf game and they got rained out, and they're sitting in a country club having a few drinks, and they're lamenting the fact that they spend all this money to send their kids to college, and then they leave because there was only tobacco and furniture making and lumber as jobs in the Research Triangle. It was fairly between Raleigh, Chapel Hill, and Durham. And so those 6 guys went out and bought 5,000 acres of land. It wasn't government. It wasn't the universities. Those 6 guys said, we want to build on 3 great universities, very similar to you, that are around us in 3 separate cities. And so they began to work with the governments and the universities, and they created, which continues to be run by a nonprofit corporation that they set up called the Research Triangle. It is the highest per capita employment and the highest educational area in the country. 40,000 people now work at the Research Triangle. That was a vision that 6 guys had. And they were willing to invest to buy that land. And they understood, and there was a lot of skepticism. People said, this is crazy, right? And so it is one of the most successful places in the country. You might know if you've been there. Another one more recently is San Diego. San Diego was a sleepy naval town through the 60s and 70s. And in 1980, the mayor of San Diego, Pete Wilson, who went on to be governor, there you go, Mayor Gwynn, and some business leaders convinced the University of California educational system to build up the University of California, San Diego. It was really almost like a community college. And they put the engineering department and some other big investments there. And University of California, San Diego gets the 6th highest amount of research dollars of any university in the country now. It has become a high-tech powerhouse since 1980 of driving technology, and they set aside some land for that technology. And Johns Hopkins gets more research dollars than any other university in America in Baltimore. $1.8 billion a year they get, and they had essentially no impact. And recently now, the city, Johns Hopkins, Forest City Development, a private company, have all partnered. And all around Johns Hopkins, if you go there today, you'll see buildings being built to take advantage of the research that is going on there and spin-offs into commercialization. What do you need for this? You need venture capital. Venture capital is the risk capital that somebody has a great idea, but they can't get the money, and they're going to go somewhere else if they can't. The United States, the good news, overwhelmingly has most of the venture capital invested in the United States. The bad news is venture capital, 3/4 of the venture capital invested in the United States is invested in 3 places. So do any of you see the Social Network movie? So what does Zuckerberg do? You know, he develops this great idea of how young men and women can meet each other. And he wants to grow it to 1 million subscribers, and he needs cash to get the equipment and everything he needs. And so what does he do? He moves his company from Boston to California to start Facebook. And there are 800 million people on Facebook now. I'm not one of them. Maybe some of you are. And it has changed how people communicate with each other and talk to each other. And that's about venture capital. And you've had some in Orlando and the Tampa area, there's several $100 million, 2007, that were invested in startup companies. And you ought to be thinking about how you participate in that. Let me talk a little bit about my city, hell with the lid off. Pittsburgh was the steel industry, the center of steel making in America. It was a dirty, polluted city. And between 1970 and 1990, the steel industry collapsed. We lost, between 1970 and 1990, 500,000 people left the Pittsburgh region. Think about that. 500,000 people left because they couldn't see a future for themselves. That's why there are lots of Steeler fans in Florida. I mean, when the Steelers play Jacksonville, there's normally more people rooting for the Steelers in the stand than there are for Jacksonville. And it was a tragedy. I delivered Meals on Wheels for 25 years in Pittsburgh, and I delivered meals to elderly people who were old when not believing that their kids aren't there with them, but their kids had to leave to find work. And so they went all over America. They left Pittsburgh. And so I was becoming mayor in 1994 and facing a city that was not clear what it was going to do, what we were going to be. And we partnered, we created, the first thing we did was we had thousands of acres of old steel mills that were reminding us every day of our decline. And the private market wasn't going to buy a steel mill. And this steel mill here, we bought, our redevelopment authority bought. It was 129 acres. My father had worked there for 51 years. And where that steel mill was and where 10,000 men and women made steel, there's now a cheesecake factory. You know, my father would have shot me if he were alive. The steel mill had been shut down, obviously, for 15 or so years. So we made a huge investment and worked with private developers to sort of share our dreams of how do you begin to rebuild a city that wasn't sure what it was. And one of the big drivers for us were the universities. Is that Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh are big research universities as yours are around here. And recently we had an old abandoned Nabisco factory right in the middle of a city neighborhood. And Google had been doing research at CMU and had 20 or 30 people, and they were successful on their research. And so they said, we're gonna move a division of Google to Pittsburgh, and we want to go in that bakery, that old abandoned bakery, and we'll work with a private developer to develop it. They didn't want to go out to the suburbs to like a clean, fancy place. They wanted to be in a neighborhood where their kids can walk to a restaurant and go to get a drink after work. And so they've put 900 jobs there now in that Nabisco bakery because of the university, first and foremost, because they love the environment. It was a great place for them to be. And this was our old football stadium. So part of this is the ability to decide what your competitive advantages are, and part of it is creating a great place. So our football team lost the Super Bowl, so that's what we did. I want to go back. Any architects in the room? So what were you all smoking and drinking in the 60s and 70s, huh? Now, I want you to look at this, even if you're not an architect. So here you have a football stadium built in 1970, looking right on the river, looking across at really a great city. And how is the riverfront used? Surface parking and a road. So what were people thinking? Huh? I mean, what were people thinking? So we got rid of it and we built a new football stadium and a new baseball park, which is considered the best in the country other than Fenway Park, and a new convention center, which is the largest green building in America, right on the river. And that's where that picture was of the road in the surface parking lot. And it's not like that every day, but it's like that a lot of days. People love to go hang out along the water. They like to use the water. It's a place of magic for people, and to walk and to ride bikes, and which we never did. When we were growing up in Pittsburgh, our mothers always told us two things: be home before the streetlights come on, and never go near the rivers. And my mother would say, if you go near those rivers, you're going to melt because they were so polluted. And of course, we break both those rules now. So let me just wrap up, because every city in America is facing this challenge. Big cities and small cities. It's about transforming yourself to be not the city we used to be, but the city that will be competitive in the 21st century? First and foremost, pretty simple, it requires leadership. You know, and the lesson I learned as mayor, and I'm sure Mayor Gwynn's learning, is that every time you want to do something new, there are going to be 100 people giving you a reason why you can't do it. You know, the safest place to be if you're a politician is to study something. Does that all sound familiar? Is that we got to think about it, and we got to be in this process. And I'm not suggesting you don't need to think about it, you don't need to be in the process. But somebody needs to be the growing up to say at some point, we're going this way. And we need to make some decisions. And the reality is how you do that and how you engage with the private sector to get them to want to invest in your community, to share the risk with them. The second is to know where you want to go. What is it you want your community to look like? You know, do you want it to be a place that has one building and then the rest of the block is surface parking? Or do you want it to be a place where there's culture and the arts and shopping and restaurants and dynamic and vibrant and exciting? You've been there. You're working on building that in Ocala. You've seen communities like that. You know, I was in Orlando a couple months ago and I went for a run around the lake, and it was in the evening about 5 or 6 o'clock. It was packed. I could hardly run. There were so many people going and walking along that lake. You see that and you say, you know what a great place when you bring people together. And arts and culture and design really do that, helps to do that. And you need to have the institutional capacity in your city. You need to have good planning who understand how to do this, and good elected officials who understand how to have a good conversation to get the community and the private sector who's going to develop, who are going to invest in your community. You need to understand how you finance the infrastructure. Somebody's figured it out. You're building roads out here. So somebody is making some investments. Your elected officials have figured out how to build the infrastructure. You need to be focused on education. You know, teachers get a bum rap. Teachers are in many ways the most important people in our community. They are going to shape your ability to compete in the future. You need to build a great place. You need to understand what your competitive advantages are, and you need an educated workforce. And that starts not in college, that starts at kindergarten. And I mentioned design. If you're going to build something, reach for the stars. Build something of high quality. Every time you're going to do something, people are going to tell you, you know, it's the wrong color, it's the wrong place, we don't need it, and of course, we can't afford it, it costs too much money. Do you think 20 years from now, people are going to ask that question? You don't want to be an it'll-do community. You want to be a community that says, look at us. We are a world-class community. So we're sitting where Horatio Nelson Jackson sat in 1903. We're looking at a world that's getting redefined. And this baby says it all. Huh? I grew up when there weren't computers. So we are looking out at the world. And you have choices that you can make. You can sort of say, we're doing okay, and let's not change. But the world's changing. The rules are changing. And you need to understand with civic leadership and political leadership that we need to focus ourselves on understanding where we fit in, where Ocala fits in. And you have great opportunity. You have great bones. You have wonderful buildings. You have a spectacular area around you with the horse country. You sit between 3 dynamic universities. You have a university developing here. You have this organization that is now located here with world-class scientists doing research. Your challenge is not that you don't have the assets. Your challenge is whether you have the community will to put it together. Good luck.